found Christianities rather than lost. Dr. David Litwa is going to take us into the voices and the people that were denied the status of being Christian by Christians. The voices that were silenced in terms of orthodoxy over the centuries. And maybe, just maybe, what if some of these voices were closer to the origins of Christianity than what became the Christian church? It happens all the time. Evolution shows these things. New models take over and the old ones are replaced. I wonder if some of these voices actually go back to a more archaic version of Christianity. This entire series, there's going to be a recording on Dr. David Litwa's Patreon. So please consider joining his Patreon. He's also going to ask questions as well so that he can keep doing the work that he's doing and producing the work, bringing it to you firsthand. MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Today, we have a special treat for you. And trust me, when I say special treat, we're delving into found Christianities. Found, not lost. And trust me, it will contrast the work that is done by Dr. Bart Ehrman on lost Christianities. In no way are we saying anything negative, but scholarship continues to grow and we learn new things. And Dr. M. David Litwa is joining us again today, and he has a book that he has written. Please tell us about this book, and you have a presentation for us today as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek. I'm very super excited about this one. I just got my copy in the mail yesterday. It has reached me down under. And it's a nice paperback and easy to carry around. And the good thing is the publisher is not going to saw off your arm and leg for this one. You do not need the hardback. Grab yourself a soft copy in the ballpark of $34, and very excited that this can reach a lot of people.
I agree with you. This is definitely going to be fun getting into it. Tell stories of the early Christians whose religious identity was either challenged or outright denied. You're going to dive into this. I'm looking forward to it. Go get you a copy, ladies and gentlemen. Tell me that you got a copy. Tell us down in the comment section that you did. I'm telling you, when I say this, I mean this. Dr. Litwa will be paying attention. He loves to see what people say. I do. Like a lot of my guests do that. And it encourages them to hear positive feedback and even critical feedback as we go. So Dr. Litwa, if you will, take us to space. I'm ready to see what the ancient Christianities that you have found have to offer us.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so this is Found Christianities, Remaking the World of the Second Century. And basically the short spiel about this book is that I'm telling the story of Christians whom other Christians denied were Christian. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, but basically you've got the second century. History of early Christianity in the second century is one of the most exciting times because Christians are doing a bunch of weird stuff and they're just getting started inventing all those traditional doctrines that you know and may not love, but the idea of apostolic succession, the idea of the Trinity, the idea of the structure of the church under a singular male bishop, the idea of canon and what's in, what's out, all of this is being invented and started right here in the second century. And there are groups, many groups, as they are today. There are probably hundreds, possibly even more than that, of Christian denominations, each of whom is proclaiming to be basically the best representation of the faith that they can be, and they don't agree. And that's where we are in the 2nd century. So one of the things that I try to do in this book is to basically integrate, that is, what some have called Gnostic Christianities into the mainstream of Christian history. So I don't favor the term Gnostic, and for the most of the book, I'm able to completely avoid it, because I think as a global category, Gnostic really doesn't mean a whole lot more than what the heresiologists meant, meaning something bad. In the 2nd century, gnosis, or knowledge, meant something good. And there were, just as there are today, many Christian groups proclaiming and to give the true gnosis, that is, the true revelation or message of Jesus. And that's simply a fact. No one, at least half a dozen groups, claimed that they were Gnostic in the sense of Christian knowers. And some of these people, including one particular group, the Nazarenes, claim to be the only true Christians on the basis of their gnosis. So gnosis is something that's really widespread, and many Christian groups are laying claim to this Gnostic title. What makes this exploration of early 2nd century Christianity different than others is what I hope to explain here. There are basically 3 models of understanding earliest Christianity in this pressure cooker time of the 2nd century. The first model one might call the conflict model, or what I sometimes like to call the horse race model, after an image from David Brake's book called The Gnostics. And this model was well represented by Bart Ehrman's Lost Christianities. That's one way of understanding. Another way of understanding this Christianity in this time might be called the laboratory model. And this model is represented by other scholars, a fantastic scholar from the UK, Judith M. Liu, and Vinrik Lohr from Germany. This is another possible model. What I'd like also to introduce here is what I'm calling the ecosystem model. And I'm going to go through all of these. So first, we'll look at this horse race model. And basically, in this model, you have discrete Jesus groups or churches or assemblies that are battling for numerical supremacy, while the winner is actually pre-declared, because the winners are already called proto-Orthodox, as if they've already won the title of Orthodoxy. Problems with this particular model is that, as it turns out, in the 2nd century, groups weren't altogether distinct. They were mixed groups, and people double dipping into different groups, and not everybody, identities were still somewhat fluid. So you didn't have a person identifying as, I'm Roman Catholic. That hadn't been invented yet. And certainly you wouldn't have people claiming to be proto-Orthodox, or because that hadn't been invented yet. So you don't know who these people are. That's the first thing. The other thing is that we don't have any sociological data for the figures of this time. We don't have really any idea about the actual numbers on the ground. So if our main question is who's winning, that is, who's winning numerically, that is in some ways a question that just ignores the fact that our data will never answer that particular question. And I know that there are books on the market, famously by Rodney Stark, saying that we can give a general estimate for numbers of Christianity. The fact is, we have no reliable data, and we never did. We don't know who is numerically larger in any city in the ancient Mediterranean, and that problem has to be faced head on. Even if we could know the numbers of early Christians, however, it's important to note that numerical superiority is not necessarily the same thing as influence. You can be an influencer and be in the extreme minority position. You can write books and treatises and be really, really well known, and yet your ideas are completely idiosyncratic. The final thing is to keep in mind here is that this horse race model or conflict model tends to prioritize heresiological discourse. What I mean by that is that heresiologists, that is the Christians who are attacking other Christian groups, are basically saying, hey, guess what? We are the numerically superior ones. We are the Orthodox ones, and everyone else is bad and a heretic. And that sort of discourse isn't in any way advancing the academic discussion. The fact that this conflict between orthodoxy and heresy is just using heresiological categories, using the categories of the apologists to understand what was going on in history doesn't make any sense. So this isn't just about, people writing books and pretending that they are theologically better than, the church down the street. That's really not the most important thing about the 2nd century. So what's another possible model for what's going on in early Christianity? Well, in the past 25 years or so, there's been more and more attention to the metaphor of the laboratory. And the laboratory model basically says that the Christians are like schools. Churches are like schools, and literate experts set up these schools and run theological experiments to gain devotees. And some things work and some things don't. Some things blow up in your face. Some things really turn out well. And out of that, you get Christian, or what comes to be known as Orthodox Christian theology, which is simply the dominant theology. Now, this is a vast improvement, in my opinion, over the conflict or horse race model, because the focus is not on the very simplistic question of who won, which really can't be determined numerically. But there are still problems here, because it still tends to put too much focus on those literate experts, those bookish book writers, and not the common Christian who was doing whatever, just living life in the Greco-Roman world, maybe practicing weird rituals, going to get their palm read, going to, seance-like events, and also going to Greco-Roman temples and having banquets there and not thinking anything of it. It suggests a degree of control that doesn't really allow for the kind of random change and variation that seems to be going on in this period. It's a crazy time, folks. As I think I've said before, it's more like a jungle than a laboratory. So this brings us to what I'd like to propose here as the ecosystem model. I'll just call it that. In this model, multiple Christian groups thrive in what might be called the 2nd century Christian biome. That is, if you imagine to yourself a huge rainforest, you've got an upper story, the canopy. And if you're looking down from like a helicopter, all you see are the tops of the trees. And those are like the literate experts who have left behind writings and treatises. And this is the stuff that we read today. But it's not all that was going on. In fact, most of the activity in the second century was going on in the lower stories beneath the canopy, far below the tops of the trees, where the monkeys and the anteaters and the bugs hang out and are just going crazy. At this level, it's not that Christians aren't in competition, they are, but they also are in codependent relationships. They are not in this heated conflict with each other. Similarly, if you think of, say, Protestants and Roman Catholics today, well, I mean, in a sort of vague sense, if you went to a Protestant church and asked them, well, are you in competition with the Roman Catholics down the street? Well, they might say yes, but when you look at their spirituality, their mission in life is not to defeat the Catholics. I mean, in a sense, Christians sort of roughly get along, except in some cases. Of course, there are, of course, exceptions, but more or less, if you look at the mainline Protestant denominations, sometimes like the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians, they're all sort of working together and have bound themselves together and don't see themselves as in mortal opposition to the church down the road. So, in other words, you have to have a model that allows for both working together and also competition. And this, I think, is the ecosystem model. And most of the competition, I should add, is very subtle. It's not like, you know, if I see you in an alley at night, I'm going to cut your throat. It's more like something very, very subtle, like you might say, like, oh, those poor, you know, Catholics in South America, they really need to be saved. Well, they're probably saying the same thing about the Protestants in North America, but the issue is they're not going out there, you know, and declaring war just because they're a different Christian group. Well, I think actually this is probably enough for one session. Let me just open it up very quickly, Derek, if you have any quick responses, anything you want to draw out of this. Because this is basically what I don't want to overwhelm your viewers. I want to basically just get my approach out there and lay that foundation. Was there anything that you think was a bit unclear or that I should draw out a little bit more?
Just to make something maybe clear is when we talk about at the top of the trees in the eco model, what we see is not just what is left, but also what wasn't kept. So there was probably literary elites that were not in the what we like to call proto-Orthodox model, that we don't have their literature, and they were probably elites who were literary masters at their craft. But because what became of the winners writing history or preserving it at the very least, that wouldn't you agree that would be also something that was kind of stamped out and left alone? All we have is the existence of it in the writings of the favored fathers they like to choose from.
Well, yes and no. So there is literature that there are figures whom we only know of through the heresiologists. That is true. But actually, when you look at all of the figures that I study, and I can just give you a basic rundown. I've got 26 chapters. The first chapter is just an intro, but I look at figures like, if your viewers have heard of Cerinthus and Simon of Samaria, Nicholas and the Nicolaitans, Menander, Saturninus, Sethians, Ophites, Basilides, Carpocrates, Valentinus, Marcion, Ptolemy, who's a disciple of Valentinus, Heraclian, another disciple of Valentinus, Marcus, also another very successful Valentinian, Noetus, probably you've not heard of that one, Tatian, Marcion's disciples, Lucanus, Apelles, and Philumene, and figures called Theodotus and Justin, the author of Baruch, Julius Cassianus, Prodicus, the Nicene preacher, and another group of Sethians. So there's a lot of material that is covered here. And when you look at this, about 90% of this material you have fragments. Either you have fragments that have been left behind, so we get the authentic voice of these people, or you have something in Nag Hammadi, or you have some large block quotations. Like one of the guys that I translated called the Refutator. We don't know his name, but he's the author of this 10-book long treatise called The Refutation of All Heresies. Great name, by the way, if you want to attack all your opponents, just say refutation of everybody. So he gave us these huge block quotes of whole treatises of his opponents. And so we've got their words, because this guy was, well, depending on your view, smart enough or dumb enough to quote them entirely. So, so we're not completely up a river when we are reading these people. So there is sometimes, yes, we have to read them through the heresiological filter, but sometimes we've got the primary material in either Nag Hammadi or in these large quotations and fragments. That's the good thing.
The final question I have, because we can go on and on, I really can't wait to get the book, because I think taking a deep dive into maybe individual characters, there's too many. We'd be on YouTube forever trying to go through all of them. Maybe we give some teases on actually zeroing in on some of these figures. But the question is, with so many figures you have that you focused in on, are there figures that we know were there, that were elites writing and were literary monsters, if you could use the term, and I mean it not derogatorily, but like they were big and they had an influence, but we don't have any of their writings at all. We don't know anything they said, but they wrote, and we know that they were writing.
Absolutely, yeah. So there are people who have been completely forgotten, but, well, obviously not completely forgotten. I mean, there may be a case where we just don't even know the name of someone who was influential. But I think in most cases we know their names. Valentinus and Vassilides are good examples of hugely influential, and Carpocrates too. They're hugely influential theologians. And for Carpocrates in particular, absolutely nothing survives from his pen. So we've got nothing but a summary of his theology. Same thing for Cerinthus. But these guys were big.
So they could have had the true, real version of this Christianity. I'm just kidding.
Well, they definitely had a version, yeah.
Imagine if they were, you know how everyone says, no, ours goes back to the very, we have the right one. What if, and I'm being funny here, but just play with me here. What if one of these guys was the closest to the original that we could find, and they don't even exist anymore? It's not ridiculous to think that the older models become extinct in this ecosystem. You kind of made it sound kind of an evolutionary model, which makes me think the old and obsolete, the stale and aren't willing to change. Survival of the fittest comes down to, is the organism willing to change to its new environment? And I doubt we see what was in the first century in the second at this point. That's our actual Christianity on the ground in the first century probably isn't even visible by the second. I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's generally accurate. And what's interesting is Valentinus and Vassilides, they both claim to be in direct apostolic succession. So Vassilides claims that his teacher, a guy by the name of Glaucius, was a direct disciple of the Apostle Peter. And Valentinus made the claim that his teacher, a guy by the name of Theodus, was a direct disciple of Paul. So these guys are claiming to be in direct succession, which means that they have secret information passed down orally that nobody else has. And this, as we'll see, is a amazingly common claim. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to basically unleash a series, just whetting the appetite of your viewers for most of the chapters in Found Christianities, and just deal with them sort of in a 20 to 30 minute session. And then, your viewers can grab the book and get all of the actual facts and data backed up, because there's plenty of footnotes. and we will go from there. And we'll hopefully maybe have a couple live sessions thrown in for questions.
So just to pitch this to everybody, I know not everybody can afford this, and I totally understand, but I would love to see people who can afford it jump on this, because what I'd like to do, if possible, here we are, adding to the stream, get the book right now, paperback, $34.95, get you a copy, well worth every penny, and much more affordable. Get the book, read it, and we're going to go through a series of things, kind of do an airplane view. I suspect we'll drop in a little more, zeroing in on some details maybe as we go. Hopefully you have a lot more questions. We'll do some live streams later, and you can get your questions out in super chats and things like that, and we can have Dr. Litwa answer those. I think that'd be a wonderful thing.
Great. Yep, it sounds good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us know what you think. I'm excited. And don't forget, we are